Welcome back to another episode of Space Plus. My guest in this episode is, in my opinion, kind of living the dream. He's been the editor of Metal Hammer magazine and now works to educate the public about space using art and music. And the conversation focuses on this organization called Space Rocks. We speak about what was one of my favorite social media campaigns, maybe of all time, which was the Rosetta and Philae mission that the European Space Agency ran some years ago now, but has remained, I think, a highlight for me personally in terms of how to do Twitter really, really well, and also how to get people to care about science. And we talk about Steven Wilson, the prog rock artist who brought out an album based on the overview effect, which we spoke about in the previous episode of Space Plus, and how he created an entire album around it and what Alex's role was in that. So I think that's enough of an introduction. Let's get straight into my conversation with Alexander Milas, the founder of Space Rocks, among many other things. So how are you today?
I'm very well. How are you?
Yeah, all right, thank you. All right, thank you. I feel like since we met last in London for the overview premiere, you've been very busy. Would that be fair to say?
There's always something going on. I juggle a few balls, you could say. And there's always much more happening behind the scenes of Space Rocks than is always readily apparent. But that's the way we like it. It's been a real adventure.
So Space Rocks was the topic I wanted to talk to you about the most this morning. I mean, I'd like to touch on a number of things, but Space Rocks seems like an organization that certainly resonates with me. And I guess what I am maybe at the very beginning of trying to do with the Space Plus platform, engaging people around space, but in ways that use kind of art and music and literature and other maybe more accessible ways to people that are a bit intimidated by the idea of science, the sort of maybe old school idea of science. Finding ways in which it also makes sense to people's day-to-day lives, the relevance of space to, the average person on the street. I think there is a story to be told there. And I'm just kind of fascinated how you got into talking about space and why, let's say a metal guy, a rock guy is spending his time talking about science and space.
Yeah, well, look, number one, I'm delighted at the interest, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it, of course, because Space Rocks is a hugely important thing to me. Space has been a source of ceaseless fascination throughout my entire life. Previously, I was an archaeologist. I fell into music journalism in an almost accidental way. And so it's definitely kind of followed a bit of a career trajectory for me to then completely have an illogical career turn. But then when you think about it, it's not illogical at all, because what happened with Space Rocks was, at the time, I was the editor of Metal Hammer magazine. And we would have these annual award shows. And just like with space, I was always looking for ways to create new angles around heavy metal music, because more than just this sort of fire-breathing, loud kind of form of music, I saw something that had global implication and frequently political ones as well. Over the years I was at Metal Hammer, I've got really invested in highlighting what came to be known as global metal, because there were so many places in the world that were producing their own scenes and their own music. And it just wasn't really being covered in the West, and the industry wasn't paying attention either. And so I kind of felt like, well, we need to change the narrative. We need to include these people in the way that we talk about this music. And so that was one thing that became hugely important to me. And it was through that I began to think about metal in different ways, just like how does it actually influence and reflect culture in wider ways. And so we began to find that there were more and more people who are out there, just Hollywood actors, scientists, people that love this music, who kind of represent our community, and they are the embodiment, not the stereotypes that you see on cop shows, but they are the people who listen to this music and promote it and share it with their friends and all that. So we should highlight them and their achievements as well. And so at our annual award show, the Metal Hammer Golden God Awards, we would bring some of these sorts of people down. Just like one year we had Christopher Lee. Another year we had Brian Blessed. I mean, you never have to justify having Brian Blessed anywhere. I mean, just absolute legend, who is also fascinated and obsessed with space, by the way. He's a trained cosmonaut. But one year, I discovered that there was a guy named Matt Taylor who was involved with the Rosetta comet landing mission. This hugely ambitious European Space Agency mission, and he's covered in tattoos. Just seemed to be kind of one of us, so to speak. And so well, we got in touch and we said, well, look, we think what you've done is amazing and we'd love to have you down to our award show. But the problem was most people wouldn't have known the name and they might have heard of the mission. So we devised a way to kind of create some noise around it all. So we contacted one of his fellow Imperial College alumni, Brian May from Queen, to come down and present the award to Matt, and it was just fantastic, because number one, it felt like Matt and the work of his team was being acknowledged in a very public way, which kind of felt necessary because as a lifelong follower of space exploration, I've always been frustrated that people aren't blown away at like these daily discoveries that seem to be happening, and they don't make the headlines because, I mean, let's be honest, most newspapers are dominated by these sort of ongoing dramas and so on, and sadly scientific innovation, things that actually I think bespeak the potential of humans, kind of get shunted by the side. And it's just like, so much of the narrative is just how horrible everything is. And it's just like, I want people to think, gosh, aren't we just amazing? So anyway, back to Rosetta. Brian May took the stage. He gave a totally rousing speech. He kind of told everyone off, not like in a really negative way, but he said, the man who's about to walk out on stage here has done an incredible thing with an incredible group of people. And it's such a tragedy that you don't all know about it because it's just as important than moon landings. It's going to change the way we see the universe. And it was something that got me thinking about things, but also we had indications from the European Space Agency that Rosetta was being covered in ways that they had never seen before. Because of course they, like any space agency, they're always trying to get the word out about what they're doing. But suddenly it's being covered by rock and metal blogs and just loads of newspapers and things and all that. So it was just like a bit of an explosion. So it got me thinking. And once I left Metal Hammer, I approached ESA and a contact there, Mark McCorcoran, who at that time was the senior advisor for science and exploration at ESA, about doing something about this. And what became Space Rocks effectively was an extension of what happened on stage. Basically, how do we find new ways of exploring these ideas, sharing them, and not just building excitement, but also having some critical distance and at times asking some hard questions, because you can't just be cheerleading all of this. You have to also be able to say, well, hang on a minute, just because we can, should we be doing this? And is there a room for debate? And there certainly is. And I think that that's something I'm perhaps the most proud of, is that Space Rocks, I feel, has an identity beyond simply telegraphing the wonder of it all. It also asks questions as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point at the end that you raised there. And it's something I'm conscious of as I am bringing my sort of outsider curiosity into the space sector. I don't just also want to, like you say, cheerleader and be like, everything's amazing and everything that's happening is positive. I think these days, I think it's fair to say that people's understanding of space is either zero or it's the headlines from a certain billionaire who's certainly overly influential in the direction that space is going in. And I think there's a lot of naturally, negative association of what is the point of all of this? It seems wasteful, it seems expensive, and it doesn't touch on my life at all. So, to sort of bring it back again, why should people care about space? Like, what impact does it have on their lives? Why do you think this is important?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think everyone should be adopting that narrative. I mean, if anything, space is not always self-justifying. But the industrialization of space, just like the commercial sector and what its implications are for what we are doing there, they're enormous, and we can't afford to ignore it. And so I think there's definitely a benefit in a public education piece when it comes to this is what's going on. But then equally, I mean, just like, we don't have to name names. When people are saying things like, well, let's just go and colonize Mars, like that's going to happen next week or something. It's like, hang on, we have a beautiful world, perfectly adapted to sustain life. Why are we talking about going to this hellhole? Just because it's ambitious and whatever else. It's like, no. We need to change that narrative. We need to focus on what's happening on this beautiful spaceship, that we call Earth. And so it's things like that as well. The idea that space is going to solve our problems is, I think, a possibly damaging one. Because it won't. If anything, and anyone who's seen their science fiction movies will know, we're going to take our problems into space if we don't solve them down here. And so it's important that we kind of, I think, perhaps allow ourselves just some time to contemplate. Unfortunately, history reveals that, that's something that humans are kind of uniquely bad at doing, which is stopping to look before they leap.
That's true. So you've seen that there's let's say like a Venn diagram of music and science, and I don't know what that overlap is. It seems like it's quite a large overlap from what you said in terms of, like Brian May is an excellent example, a very well-known figure from the world of rock, who's also quite senior, and respected scientist in his own right. What is it that you think art and music and literature and poetry, and I like to think of, people talk about STEAM rather than STEM, science, technology, engineering, arts, and maths, like to think of it kind of as a whole rather than these maybe artificial divisions. What is it that the arts do to make science more digestible, let's say, do you think?
Yeah, well, no, I think it's a really good question. I think in some ways they meet in the middle. You talk to Mark McCorkran, from just like one of the biggest music fans that I know. Many scientists love music. Another great friend, Stuart Clark, who among others has written a book called Beneath the Night Sky about like the sort of the ancient connection between stargazing and culture, and there are all these different ways of looking at it, but the best explanation I've ever found for why space rocks exist and why there is this connection between space and everything else is because when you look at the night sky, you use science to explain what's up there. You use art to express how you feel, and that's what the connection is two things. Because as humans, we're not just rational beings, we're also feeling ones as well. And so there's always been that deep interconnection between, I think, just like the scientific rationalization of the world, and also, finding ways to kind of, explain, the human condition, and I think that, anyone who's looked at the night sky has probably felt that sense of wonder and at times terror as well, just like, a bit of vertigo kind of looking up there. And we use art to kind of explain that. And so when you look at how much art, music, and self-expression has been influenced by the night sky, it's actually extraordinary. But when you look at it the other way, so much science, so many people who actually do science are also deeply feeling people. And I think that that's the thing that is so important to convey, is that the people behind these missions, the people that are doing this, they're also thinking and feeling human beings as well. And I find it so sad that that's also overlooked. I've been involved in a project around the cluster mission, recently, a 25-year mission, just a heliophysics mission studying it all. And when you talk to people who have done that, what's really striking is it's just that they've had births and deaths and marriages and house moves all happen during the time of this 25-year space mission, which recently concluded, and it's touched their lives in really kind of profound ways. And so beyond the sort of philosophical connection with art, there's also like the story of the people that actually do this work that I think is very much needing to be told. And and acknowledged.
Yeah, that's excellent. That makes a lot of sense. And yeah, you're right. There's I kind of went down a little bit of a rabbit hole of thinking of other figures a bit like Brian May, who are known in both worlds. And I mean, off the top of my head, you have the other Brian Cox, although less metal. He was in pop bands, wasn't he? But then I think about Dexter Holland from The Offspring, another band that I'm a fan of. I think he's a molecular biologist. I mean, probably it's a very long list, isn't it?
Oh yeah, of course, and of course, bear in mind, space rocks, sometimes creates a bit of a problem for itself because where the name comes from is related to Tim Peake. When he was doing his Principia mission, he was aboard the space station for 6 months, and he would tweet his favorite music, and he would always just hashtag space rocks, which is where it came from. It's very lovely of Tim to actually come to our first 2 big events that we did in London before the pandemic, and he was a massive supporter. But we cover all kinds of music, but also all kinds of self-expression as well. Obviously, we're interested in science fiction as an entry point because that's usually what people are exposed to first. Not hard science, but it's going to be Star Trek or this or that. And it's just, some people poo-poo the idea, but it's a great entry point, and it's a great way to talk about what actually occurs and what is actually out there. But there's so much in the visual sphere as well. There's so much in terms of writing and literature. If you've not had the chance to kind of dive into just like that area of literature, which isn't science fiction, but just like areas that just deal with space in, I guess, more poetic ways. Then it's worth doing, and that this is the thing. I think that as humans, we've been fixated with the night sky, and so my background's in archaeology, and so I hate oversimplification, but I do think one thing is true is that just like there's something about humans that makes us wonder about what's over the next hill, and I think probably for as long as we've been human, we've been wondering what's up there. I think that this is more than just a curiosity among many others. I think curiosity about the night sky and what that is something that kind of probably unites all cultures. All cultures have a system of myths and beliefs related to explain, just what happens up there and so on. And so I think there's something profound, so it's not just art, it's also anthropological.
And you're right that probably both of those feelings, both of those innate qualities of humans are as old as each other. Like, we have been looking up at the sky and wondering what that's all about as long as we have been making music, even if it was as simple as bashing 2 rocks together, right? These are 2 deeply profound, fundamental human qualities. So yeah. Of course they are linked. I think maybe the division is the unnatural thing that has sort of grown as we've become a modern society, and you can either do this or that, but it's a false division.
I completely agree, and I think that that's one of the things that we can work to kind of correct in some sense. Because of course a lot of this, let's be honest, is no longer just about curiosity about the night sky and explaining what's out there. Now we have other things that we need to bring into the fold, which is perhaps philosophy, a system of ethics, maybe even just like a way of governing the way that we go into space and the way that it is used, because we are at the point in human history where obviously if we don't destroy ourselves, we may be doing things in space that will have implications on future generations, many centuries down the line. And perhaps we need to start thinking about these things in terms of policy. And so there's more than just the wonder of space and explaining it through art. There's also helping people understand it so they can make more informed decisions as inhabitants of Earth. If they're lucky enough to live in a democracy, perhaps it will influence the way that they vote on things as well. Because it's not just, well, what's that pretty thing up there? It's also, it's mining. It's people talking about things like colonization, not a word that's frequently associated with positive developments. And yet it's used in a really kind of almost a haphazard way these days. And I think that's scary, and I think we should be scared, because what it could mean for future generations is really, I think, a cause for some concern.
Totally. And I think the idea of using the inspirational, pretty pictures. I mean, right now, as we're talking, I've got the background of one of the first photos from the new Vera Rubin Observatory behind us. You know, these wonderful images that really kind of inspire, you know, maybe you might say the sort of traditional idea of space is one thing. And then, you know, you started talking about policy and commercialization of space. Here in Scotland, we're about to see sovereign launch. We're about to see rockets actually taking off from the UK, delivering satellites into space for the first time. And there's a conversation to be had about how much is going into space, what the cost, and I'm talking economic cost, but I'm talking environmental cost as well, is. These are things that are already part of, you know, moving through the world, using maps, using the internet, using our banking apps. We already rely on space. It's already built in. And I think Scotland has the opportunity, because it's still growing, to embed the sort of right ethical and sustainable approaches, but only if enough people are talking about it. And we had the first Space Plus night, which brought in me kind of almost accidentally scaring people a little bit about the seriousness of the issues around space junk, but then trying to draw that through line to some of the more inspirational elements. So we had music that came from the Golden Record played on the night. So trying to find that through line to make sure that you know, we can try and take inspiration from space, but also critique it at the same time. And I'm glad you mentioned the Rosetta mission, because that was, from my opinion, one of the best public engagement projects in modern space history, I would say. And, you know, that was peak Twitter as well.
Yes. Yeah, no, it was definitely the halcyon days of Twitter. You know, it's I think it's sad how much the landscape has changed there, because as a free form method of communication and, you know, expression and interaction, I thought it was just absolutely fantastic. And one of the wonderful things about Rosetta was that it was so humanized as well. You know, just the way, you know, they created like the anthropomorphic version of, you know, Rosetta and Philae and so on. It just you did feel like it was something out there, like it was like an avatar, you know, representing us out there. And yeah, I'm not sure how well you remember the play of events. It was a little while ago now, but when they lost contact with the lander and then it came back, it was so dramatic, you know. I remember talking to Matt Taylor about this. You know, it's just like, gosh, were you worried about it landing and this and that? It's like, well, no. The first thing is after 12 years, if it's going to wake up, that's the really big thing. And again, it's just like, just imagine spending, you know, just like years and years working on a thing, and then it either works or it doesn't, you know. And, you know, you've either succeeded or failed and all that. I mean, that's high drama, you know.
Yeah.
But I totally agree. They did such a phenomenal job, and there are many people deserving of acknowledgement there for I think doing a wonderful thing for, I think, what is still just like, you know, has to be hands down just like one of the greatest achievements in terms of space exploration, because the ambition of it all. And I should mention the ambition films, you know, that were made around that, kind of like a sort of like a sci-fi themed vision of you know, humanity, you know, many years from now, looking back on things that we did in the past, and the Rosetta mission, which Mark McCorcoran was very involved with creating. I think Rosetta stands out as not just exemplary in terms of achievement, but also, as you say, I think public engagement, you know, just the way that it made people care, you know, in a way that many missions, unfortunately, they're doing equally extraordinary things. And not everything is about big numbers. Not everything is about just like this big superlative thing. Some things are doing things that seem like a little less, you know, press worthy, but are equally important. And not everything has to have that huge wow factor. But making people care, I think, is hugely important, not just in terms of changing their perspective on the things, but also I think it has a lot of influence on public support for space programs, because people, as you say, I mean, they're always going, well, why are we spending all that money? And of course, corporations don't need to justify why they spend the money because they're doing it for profit. Space agencies do if they're publicly funded.
On a fraction of the budget too.
And yes, on a fraction of the budget. And how many of those people questioning those budgets know how much that useless highway cost? Or how much that high rise that was subsidized cost or whatever else. Like, people are right to question that, but they should probably be questioning everything else as well. Because if they had any idea how many useless publicly funded projects are going on, they'd probably be pretty angry. But space just seems to be targeted because it seems superfluous somehow, and yet it's fundamental to what's next.
You're right, yeah. And we were just talking there about ambitious projects. I just want to bring us back to Steven Wilson again. You were much closer to the creation of the Overview album, so maybe you have a different take on this. But I have to say, as much as I personally love it, but I'm both a metalhead and a space nerd, did you expect for that album on its release to be vying for the #1 album release chart in the UK?
I think that surprised everyone. Although, I think there was a quiet confidence, in the Steven Wilson camp. Not that I think that anyone there thought it, was deserved. But Steven Wilson, as a fellow fan, you'll know, is so much bigger than anyone who doesn't know about Steven Wilson has any idea on, because he's almost got this strange invisibility because he doesn't fit any kind of, he's not a pop star. He's not a cliched rock star in any way. Sorry about the noise in the background. Apologies. One of the challenges that Steven Wilson, I think, has is that music and music media and all the writing around music, everything else, has unfortunately made it impossible for unique artists, I think, to become known in a traditional way. The media landscape is very different now. It's all about social media. He doesn't do bite-sized, throwaway quotes. He doesn't do, awful, kind of embarrassing, TikToks or whatever else. He's a hugely self-expressive guy, but he has an enormous following. Did he play the London Palladium 4 times in a row? And sold that out. I mean, it's extraordinary. So it's not just that he made a number, I think it ended up like #3 in the UK charts, for instance. It's that almost every other artist who was charting that week, they were all streaming artists. And Steven did that primarily on people buying physical products, which is a very, very different thing. And so when you consider how antithetical that record is to what you consider like a pop record, basically you had 2 tracks, 42 minutes, and it's about space and all these abstract concepts. I think that it's not just a statement about Steven and his immensity as an artist. It is also a statement about the often overlooked intelligence of the record-buying public, because everything about the way that the music industry works, and a lot of the Hollywood as well, let's be honest, tells you that people just don't have attention spans anymore. Not true. People don't want things with quality and depth anymore. They just want, no, not true either. To me, it's more than Steven Wilson's success there. It's an affirmation that the sort of like the floods of what you could say is just kind of like throwaway art, just like, the sort of like this musical fast fashion. That is not the way forward. Steven made something that is lasting and impactful and meaningful, and it flies in the face of all of those assumptions. And I think that's the real success beyond the record sales, is that it made a powerful statement that there is an audience out there that's being overlooked.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of bring it back to Space Rocks then, my understanding is that you had Steven Wilson on, you were talking to him in the course of your work with Space Rocks and introduced him to the concept of the overview effect as part of your conversation. And this obviously sparked an idea in his head, which then inspired the album, The Overview. Is that a fair characterization? And if so, like, how does it feel that you went on to influence this, very popular album about space?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, he's very kind to acknowledge my very tiny role in all of that. But really, we just went to lunch. I had known Stephen for some time. Aside from being the editor of Metal Hammer, I was also very involved with sister publication, Prog magazine. Jerry Ewing, who started the magazine, is a close friend and colleague and so on. And so I wrote for Prog for a long time. As a big supporter, and Stephen actually straddled both worlds, of course. Primarily via the medium of his work with Opeth. And a lot of fans of Opeth then discovered Stephen Wilson and Porcupine Tree, and Storm Corrosion came about, and all of these things. And so we'd interacted before, but yeah, I was just telling him a little about what I was doing with Space Rocks and so on, and we began to just sort of like converse on that, when we were talking, because I wanted to see if perhaps we could involve him with some of the things that we're doing, because he seems very interested, but really interested, and so suddenly it's just like this movie, this book, just like this and whatever, and it's just one of those things where I guess that's why he is who he is, and that's why he's been able to do what he was able to do, is just like massively unqualified little old me, sending him a few links, basically set him on this path, of discovery, and then just like maybe 3 months later, it's just like, listen to this, and that's just an extraordinary thing. And so I take 100% zero credit for anything that Stephen has done. He's a magnificent artist, but yeah, it's obviously a deeply humbling and wonderful thing to think in some small way I might have been a catalyst for all of that, in that conversation. But it's all him. That's all his achievement. I mean, he's an extraordinary artist and musician, and he can kind of do anything he wants, because I'm not saying he's all powerful in like some reverential way, but he's a rare example of an artist who's in full command of his powers. Like he can put his talents and know-how to almost anything and come back with something, I think, worth listening to. And I guess the thing about the overview is that it is such a great example of what happens when these worlds collide. I think he's made something that's timeless and something that will be meaningful for many, many years. And that's a cool thing to be a tiny, tiny part of.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, again, thank you for the work that you do with Space Rocks. I mean, that is, if that's not a perfect example of why it's worth it, then I don't know what is.
Yeah, that's very kind. I mean, to be honest, Space Rocks is more than just me, and there's some phenomenal people that I've been able to work with over the years. Mark McCork and Matt Taylor, of course, huge supporters. Just the reason why it looks the way it does. James, John, who does our events. All these people are just integral parts of it all. But it's also a lot of people meeting us halfway as well. Because I guess when people question funding for space programs and so on, very much the same way they question what is Space Rocks? Why should we be doing this? And so it is useful to have things like, look at this Stephen Wilson record, isn't this great? Look how many people this reached and how many ideas. And of course, we're a totally private organization. It's just it's one of these things where we work with these in other places, but we're doing this because we're passionate about what we do, and we think it deserves a place, and so that's why, I guess, incredibly, we're getting on for 7 years since our first ever event, which is, I think, an astonishing thing. Of course, the pandemic wiped everything out, but then we started Uplink on our YouTube channel, and that was a real joy, to bring so many people together. And so we keep on going. But conversations like these just, I think, are important, because it's lovely to connect with people, like yourself, who are pulling in the same direction and understand, just like why we're doing what we do.
And that spirit of collaboration is so important. It's definitely not about competing with each other. Everything is stronger when you're collaborating, right? And I get the sense, again, new to the space sector, that certainly here in the UK and within Scotland, everyone is more in a collaborative mindset than trying to compete with each other. And yeah, I'm hoping to see kind of more of that. And I worked with Rachel Lyons from Space for Humanity, to help me kind of get set up here with Space Plus. She kind of connected me to Frank White. Frank White is the man who coined the phrase the overview effect. I know he's very keen to connect with Stephen Wilson. Maybe we can chat about that afterwards. I like that spirit, that approach, where it's all stronger by working together. So maybe we should just wrap up by asking what is coming up next with Space Rocks. Like, what can people who have maybe just learned about it through this conversation, how can they get involved? What should they be looking out for? What's on the horizon?
Well, they can come to our website, spacerocksofficial.com, sign up to our Substack, which we're launching imminently. And we're going to have a few announcements coming up soon about events here and abroad. And we actually have a documentary film that's going to be coming out very soon indeed. So we'll have more details when that's ready for prime time. But yeah, there's always something going on in our world, and hope you'll keep us informed about what's going on in Space Plus's world as well.
Thank you very much. I just noticed your Iron Maiden poster in the back there, and I thought you'd appreciate that the first night that I ever saw the Northern Lights was the same night that I came back from an Iron Maiden tribute show.
Wow.
And the two experiences are now melded like that in my memory.
Well, I mean, just which was more spectacular, I'm sure.
Oh, it's hard to say. It's very hard to say.
Yeah. Very good. Well, enjoy to spend this time with you, Stuart. Thanks so much for having me.